The record was 23 hours and 55 minutes. That was how long the last maid lasted inside Raymond Cucurella's home before she was escorted out, trembling, clutching her coat to her chest, unable to explain to the police why she had simply quit a job paying 4 times the market rate. She never told them about the silence. She never told them how a man could stand in a doorway and say nothing at all, and somehow the nothing felt like a loaded gun pressed against the back of your neck. She just said, "I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. I couldn't do it." Raymond Cucurella was not the most feared name in the city because of what he had done. He was feared because of what he refused to do. He refused to raise his voice. He refused to repeat himself. He refused to tolerate the sound of a coffee cup touching a saucer too hard, a heel clicking on marble, a phone vibrating in someone's pocket 2 rooms away. His home was not a home. It was a held breath, a place where even the clocks had been removed because the ticking made his right eye twitch. Men in his position had enemies. Raymond had silence. And silence, he had decided long ago, was the only thing that had never betrayed him. He was 39 years old, dark-bearded, built like a man who had once had to drag himself out of a river with one good arm and had simply never forgotten how. His suits were always black. His voice, on the rare occasions he used it, was low enough that people instinctively leaned forward, which was exactly why he used it that way. He wanted them close when he told them the truth. 4 maids in 3 months. The agency had stopped calling. They sent an email instead. "Mr. Cucurella, we regret to inform you that we are unable to continue placing candidates in your residence at this time." He read it once, set his phone face down, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then his driver, Enzo, slid a paper across the desk. "There's a woman," Enzo said carefully, "outside, in the alley by the east gate. She's been there since last night, with bags." Raymond didn't look up. "Call the shelter." "She won't go. She keeps saying she doesn't need help. She's just sitting there, in the sleet." Raymond was quiet for 4 seconds, his version of a long pause. "Bring her in." Her name was Bree. She stood in his kitchen at 6 a.m., still damp from the cold, and she did not look around at the marble and the crystal and the vaulted ceiling the way most people did. She looked directly at him. But that was the first unusual thing. The second unusual thing was that she answered his single question, "Can you be quiet?" with a nod that was almost offensively calm, as if the question were beneath her. He hired her on the spot. He told her the rules. She agreed to every single one without flinching. He did not know, when he told her to collect her things from outside and bring them to the servants' quarters, that her things included 3 identical 5-year-old girls, currently folded into a laundry hamper on a luggage trolley, holding their breath with the focused discipline of tiny soldiers. Bella, Chloe, and Mia. They didn't understand what a mafia boss was. They understood castles. And this, Bella had whispered to her sisters as the trolley rolled through the service entrance, her eyes enormous, is definitely a castle. And every castle, Mia had whispered back, with complete, unshakable 5-year-old logic, has a king who needs a crown. Raymond Cucurella had enforced silence in his home for 6 years. He had approximately 36 hours before 3 small girls began quietly, methodically, and with tremendous personal joy, destroying every single one of his rules. He didn't know that yet. He was sitting in his study, in the silence he had built like a fortress around himself, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the house felt slightly less empty than usual. He told himself it was nothing. He was a man who trusted nothing he couldn't verify. But somewhere in the walls, in the laundry hamper that was now very quietly giggling, the thing that would undo Raymond Cucurella was already inside his gates, and it had pigtails. But if you need to know what happens when the most feared man in the city wakes up to find a plastic tiara on his head and 3 identical faces waiting to see his reaction, you already know to hit subscribe. The sleet had started just after midnight. By the time Raymond's convoy turned off the boulevard and rolled toward the east gate, it had been falling for 3 hours, and the alley beside the perimeter wall was glazed with a thin skin of ice that caught the headlights and threw them back in fractured pieces. Raymond was not looking at the alley. He was looking at his phone, at a message from Enzo that required a response in the next 4 minutes, when the convoy slowed without instruction. He looked up. She was sitting on a single leather duffel bag that had seen better years, her back pressed against the stone wall, and she had arranged herself around 3 cloth bundles in her lap and at her sides with the focused, total commitment of a woman who had made a decision and intended to die before she reversed it. She wasn't holding a sign. She wasn't looking at the cars. She was simply there, in the sleet, in the way that people are when they have run out of places to be and have decided that this particular spot, unremarkable as it was, would have to be enough. Raymond watched her for a moment through the tinted glass. "Stop the car," he said. Enzo stopped the car. The thing Raymond would never admit, not to Enzo, not to his lieutenant, not to the mirror, was that it was not pity that made him open the door. Raymond Cucurella did not traffic in pity. It was something colder and more precise than that. It was the recognition of a person who had chosen a wall over a shelter, and the involuntary, almost clinical respect that surfaced in him whenever someone refused to ask for help, even when they were quietly drowning in need of it. He stepped out. The sleet touched his Keaton overcoat and slid off the wool without leaving a mark. She looked up at him without flinching, which was, in his experience, either the sign of someone very brave or someone who had already accepted the worst and found it manageable. Her face was angular and tired, but not defeated. There was a distinction, and he noted it. At her sides and in her lap, the 3 bundles shifted slightly. He looked at them. She pulled them closer, almost imperceptibly, with the kind of reflexive movement that required no thought, because it came from a place deeper than thought. "How long have you been here?" he said. It was not a question the way most people asked questions. "Since yesterday evening," she said. "Where did you sleep?" "I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. The sleet fell between them. "Can you work?" he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not hope. It was too guarded for hope. More like the careful attention of someone calculating whether a thing is real before allowing themselves to believe in it. "Yes," she said. He told her his name. He watched her face do the thing faces always did when they heard it. A small, involuntary recalibration, a tightening around the eyes. But she didn't stand up and walk away. She stayed where she was, which told him everything he needed to know about how desperate she was. And also, he thought, about the quality of her nerve. "I have one rule," he said. "Silence. I hear everything. A dropped glass, a phone on, vibrate behind a closed door, a cupboard that doesn't close correctly. If you can keep my house the way I require it, you will be paid well and left entirely alone." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "If you bring chaos into my house, you leave in a body bag. That is not a figure of speech." She held his gaze. "Understood," she said. Her name was Bree. He learned this in the car. He did not ask about the bundles. She did not offer. This was an arrangement that suited them both for entirely different reasons. The servants' quarters sat at the far end of the east wing, a suite of 3 rooms that hadn't been occupied in 11 months, still furnished with the heavy silence of disuse. A fretted-linen duvet folded at the foot of the bed. A crestron panel on the wall that controlled the underfloor heating. A window that looked out over the topiary garden and the fountain that ran even in winter, lit from beneath the water in pale amber. Bree set the duffel down. Then she unzipped it. Then she lifted the edge of the laundry hamper she had asked Enzo, with spectacular composure, to bring up from the trolley. 3 small faces blinked up at her in the lamplight. Bella, Chloe, Mia. Quietly, Bree whispered, pressing one finger to her lips with an urgency that was not theatrical. We are going to be very, very quiet. Do you understand me? 3 identical heads nodded. Above them, somewhere in the vast and silent house, Raymond Cucurella settled into his poltrona Frau chair, poured 2 fingers of Class Azul into a crystal glass, and listened to the silence he had spent 6 years perfecting. It was, he decided, as complete as ever. It lasted 4 days. 4 days of genuine, almost miraculous quiet, during which Bree moved through the mansion like a woman diffusing something. Precise, unhurried, her footsteps so deliberate on the Calicut marble that Raymond, listening from his study with the particular attention of a man who had trained himself to hear what others couldn't, registered nothing more than the soft press and release of rubber soles on stone. She learned the house the way a careful person learns a new language, not by speaking it, but by listening to it first. Which hinges breathed, which corridor carried sound upward through the coffered ceiling, at which drawer in the boffy kitchen required a 2-stage pull to avoid the small, traitorous click. 4 days. On the 5th morning, Bella got bored. It was not a sudden thing. It built the way pressure builds, quietly, invisibly, until the vessel it inhabits can no longer pretend to contain it. Bree had arranged the servants' quarters into something functional and private, with the bathroom as their domain during Raymond's morning briefings, and the small adjoining sitting room transformed into a play area, using items she had requested under the guise of personal effects. Coloring books, a set of plush animals, a puzzle depicting the solar system. She had done everything right. She had accounted for hunger, for restlessness, for the low-grade chaos that 3 5-year-olds generate simply by existing in proximity to one another. She had not accounted for Bella deciding, at 6:40 on a Tuesday morning, that the solar system puzzle was finished, the plush animals had been named and organized, and named again, and that the door Bree had explained with grave and absolute seriousness was not to be opened, was simply a rectangle that had not yet been properly investigated. By the time Bree emerged from the bathroom, Bella was gone. Chloe and Mia sat in the middle of the floor, looking at the open door with the wide-eyed, frozen expression of 2 people who had watched something happen and were now reconsidering their own involvement. What followed was 11 minutes that Bree would later describe, internally and only to herself, as the single most terrifying experience of her adult life. A silent, frantic search through the lower service corridor, or conducted in near darkness, in socked feet, with her heart producing a sound she was certain was audible from space. She found Bella in the kitchen, standing on the lowest rung of the Gagano oven handle, reaching toward the upper shelf, where someone had left a canister of 00 flour. She retrieved her daughter with a grip that communicated volumes without a single word. She did not notice the small, perfect footprint pressed into the fine dusting of flour that had shaken loose and settled on the countertop below. Raymond noticed it at 7:15. He came to the kitchen for the same reason he came every morning, not because he was hungry, but because the ritual of preparing his espresso on the La Marzocca machine was one of the few domestic acts he had never delegated, a private insistence on doing one small, ordinary thing himself. He set his phone face down on the Patagonia quartzite counter. He measured the grounds. He tamped them with the flat, even pressure of long habit. Then he looked to his left. He stood very still for a moment. The footprint was small enough to fit inside his palm with room to spare, pressed cleanly into the white powder with the rounded clarity of a child's bare foot. 4 toes and a heel pointing toward the refrigerator. He crouched. He looked at it for a long time with the focused, unhurried attention he normally reserved for documents requiring decisions of consequence. Then he straightened, picked up his espresso, and walked directly to the security room on the 2nd floor. The system was a Genetec Omnicast network, 62 cameras, motion activated, feeding into a monitoring station with a curved, ultra-wide display that showed the entire property in a grid of cool blue rectangles. Raymond sat down and began rewinding from 6 a.m. He watched the kitchen corridor. He watched the service hallway. He moved from feed to feed with methodical patience, expanding timestamps, isolating movement signatures. He found nothing. What he did not know, what he had no reason to know, because no adult had ever breached his security by these means, was that the laser perimeter sensors along the lower corridor were calibrated at knee height. A measurement perfectly, accidentally, ideally suited to stop a grown man in his tracks. A 5-year-old, crawling flat on her stomach across the heated herringbone floor, passed beneath every single beam without disturbing one. Raymond stared at the empty corridor on the screen. He rewound it once more. Still nothing. He set his espresso cup down on the console with a care that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with the specific, controlled stillness of a man who is not yet ready to articulate what he is feeling. He went back to his study. He sat in his chair. He told himself the flower had been disturbed by a draft. He did not believe it. The sleep deprivation had a texture to it by the 4th day. It was not the blunt, heavy exhaustion of a man who had simply worked too long. Raymond had known that kind of tiredness and had learned to wear it like a coat. Unpleasant, manageable, something to be shrugged off with espresso and discipline and the particular force of will that had carried him through worse. This was different. This was a slow erosion of the edges of things, a softening of the line between what was certain and what was merely probable, so gradual and so precise that the most unsettling part of it was that he kept noticing it. A man who could still observe his own unraveling, he had decided sometime around 3 in the morning on the 3rd night, was a man who had not yet fully unraveled. He held on to this thought with both hands. He had not told anyone. He would not. The insomnia had its reasons, as it always did. A territory dispute developing 3 cities east, a shipment delayed at the port, the particular silence of his own mind in the dark hours that had always been, despite everything, the loudest sound in any room he occupied. He worked through the nights at his promemoria writing desk, its leather surface unmarked, its brass hardware catching the low light of the single lamp he allowed himself. He drank water. He did not drink more than 2 espressos after 8 p.m. He observed every rule of discipline he had built around himself over 20 years, and none of them touched the sleeplessness even slightly. On the afternoon of the 4th day, he went to the library. It was the one room in the house he had never considered reducing to pure function. 3 walls of shelving in dark-stained walnut, a rolling brass library ladder on a ceiling-mounted track, a pair of Giorgetti armchairs angled toward the tall window that looked out over the south garden. He came here when he needed the specific quiet of books. Not their content, but their presence. The way a room full of things that had already said everything they intended to say carried a different kind of silence than an empty room. He was standing at the far shelving, pulling a volume he had read before and intended to read again, when he saw her. She was at the opposite end of the library, half obscured by the brass ladder, and she was quite small and quite blonde, and she was looking directly at him with an expression of absolute frozen astonishment. The expression he noted with the detached clarity of extreme fatigue, of someone who had not expected to encounter another person, and was now calculating at tremendous speed what to do about it. Raymond did not move. The girl did not move. He blinked. One slow, deliberate blink, of the kind a man deploys when he is testing the reliability of his own vision, and when he opened his eyes, she was gone. Simply gone. The library ladder swayed on its track, almost imperceptibly, as though something the weight of a breath had brushed against it. He stood in the silence for a long moment. Then he walked to the window and looked at the garden, which was empty and bright and entirely real, and he pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and applied steady pressure until the faint ringing in his ears subsided. He told himself, 4 days without adequate sleep. He told himself, the mind generates images to fill vacancies it cannot otherwise explain. He had read enough about the mechanics of sleep deprivation to understand the clinical sequence. Visual artifacts were documented. They were not, he reminded himself with great firmness, meaningful. He went back to work. He saw the second one 3 hours later. He was moving through the upper corridor toward his bedroom, not to sleep, simply to retrieve a document from the safe behind the Basquiat print, when a small figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, near the window seat with its rubelli velvet cushions, and this one did not freeze the way the first one had. This one turned, very deliberately, and padded around the corner and out of sight with the unhurried confidence of a creature that had decided it was no longer afraid. Raymond stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, blonde, small, moving through his house with a certainty that suggested, impossibly, familiarity. He thought about the girl he had failed to protect years ago, his sister's youngest, taken in a retaliation he had not seen coming, the single miscalculation of his career, and the one he had never permitted himself to fully examine since, because examining it would require sitting still with it, and sitting still with it felt, even now, like standing on a surface he knew would not hold his weight. The guilt, he decided, was finding new architecture. It had run out of space in the dark hours and had begun constructing itself in daylight, populating his corridors with small blonde shapes that appeared and dissolved before he could bring them into focus. He was, he concluded, unwell. He would sleep tonight. He would force it. He would not mention this to anyone alive. The chocolates had been a gift from a man who was now afraid to visit in person. They arrived monthly from a confectioner in Turin, a flat obsidian box, lacquered and sealed with a wax emblem containing 24 pieces of single-origin dark chocolate infused with things like black truffle and aged Madagascan vanilla, each one set into its own cavity in the silk-lined interior like a gemstone awaiting appraisal. Raymond did not eat them with any particular frequency. He ate one occasionally at the end of a long evening with a finger of aged Armagnac in a baccarat crystal tumbler, and the ritual was less about pleasure than about the deliberate, disciplined practice of allowing himself one small thing that had no strategic value whatsoever. It was the closest he came, in his private hours, to rest. He had been looking forward to it since Tuesday. The box was open on his desk, which was itself unusual because he had not opened it. The silk interior was in considerable disarray. 11 of the 24 pieces were gone, not taken with any care or discernment, but apparently selected at random, with several half unwrapped and their gold foil left in small, crumpled formations across the leather desk surface, and one, inexplicably, bearing the clear, small impression of a front tooth along one edge, as though someone had bitten into it, reconsidered, and set it back down. Raymond stood behind his desk and looked at this for a measured and very quiet moment. Then he pressed the intercom panel on the wall. Lutron, brushed bronze, 1 of 7 throughout the house, and said Bree's name once, at a volume that required no repetition. She appeared in the doorway in under 4 minutes, which told him she had been moving fast. Or she was composed in the way that people are composed when composure is costing them something, her hands folded in front of her, her expression attentive and still. She looked at his face first. Then, with the involuntary, helpless guilt of a person who already knows the subject of the conversation, her eyes moved to the desk. Raymond watched her see the box. He watched the composition flicker. "The chocolates," he said. "I can explain. I don't require an explanation." His voice was the same temperature it always was, which in some ways was more difficult to receive than anger. Anger, Bree had learned in her years of difficult employment, was loud and therefore finite. It spent itself. What Raymond produced was something that simply sat in the room and occupied it completely, leaving no air for anything else. "Why, I require an accounting. Items have gone missing from this house before you've arrived. Nothing has gone missing since. Until today, when 11 pieces of confectionery I had specifically imported from Italy appear to have been eaten by someone with very small teeth." Bree said nothing. There was, genuinely, nothing useful to say. "I told you when I hired you," Raymond continued, moving from behind the desk with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere more pressing to be, "that I hear everything in this house. I want you to understand that I mean this more broadly than sound." He stopped at the window, looking out over the garden with his hands folded behind his back, his Cesare Attolini jacket pulling perfectly across his shoulders. "I notice everything. The flower in the kitchen, the library ladder that moved without cause, the curtain in the upper hall that was disturbed from the inside on a day when there was no wind." He paused. "I have been a patient man, because patience is a tool I have learned to use. But I find today that I have reached the edge of it." He turned from the window. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Bree's face underwent something. Not collapse exactly, but a kind of rapid internal reorganization. A person recalculating from the ground up when the ground has just disappeared. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, for just one fraction of a moment, went somewhere private and frightened before she pulled them back. "Mr. Cucurella, 1 hour," he said again, and returned to his desk, lifting a document from the leather correspondence tray in the manner of a man who has concluded a meeting. Bree turned from the doorway. She walked back down the corridor with her hands at her sides, and her footsteps as measured and deliberate as they had ever been, because she would not let this house hear her panic, not even now, not even with everything unraveling beneath her feet. In the servants' quarters, behind a closed door, 3 small girls were sleeping soundly on their Sfera cotton sheets, entirely unaware that they had just eaten their mother's only way out. Bree packed the way she did everything in this house, without sound. She pulled the duffel from beneath the Poltrona Frau bed frame and set it open on the duvet and began placing things inside it with the careful, economical movements of a woman who had packed under pressure before and knew that efficiency was the only dignity available to her in this particular moment. The girls' things first. Always the girls' things first. She folded Mia's red dress with the white collar, then Chloe's, then Bella's. 3 identical squares of fabric that she pressed flat and set into the bag with a precision that had nothing to do with neatness, and everything to do with having no other available outlet for what was moving through her chest. She did not cry. She had made a rule about crying during packing, instituted some years ago, and she intended to honor it. Behind her, the three girls sat on the edge of the bed and watched their mother with the grave, as attentive silence of children who understood that something had gone wrong without yet understanding the architecture of it. They had been woken from their nap and told in a whisper to sit still and be quiet and not to touch anything, and for approximately 4 minutes they had managed all three of these things simultaneously, which was, by any reasonable measure, a personal record. It was Bella who slid off the bed first, then Chloe, then Mia, who paused to pick up the small plastic tiara that had been part of a dress-up set Bree had packed from their previous life, pink, rhinestoned, missing one prong, beloved beyond all reason, and carried it with her as she followed her sisters to the door that Bree had left fractionally ajar while she moved between the wardrobe and the duffel. Bree did not notice. She was pressing her palm flat against the top of the bag, calculating volume, recalculating, because there were always more things than the bag was willing to accept, and this problem required her full attention. By the time she turned around, the door was empty. Raymond had not intended to lie down. He had returned to the main hall with the specific purpose of reviewing a contract that Enzo had left on the console table near the entrance. A promemoria console in smoked oak, its surface home to a single orchid in a ceramic pot, and the manila envelope that currently required his signature on 3 pages. He had picked up the envelope. He had stood at the console and opened it and read the first paragraph, and then read it again, because the words had rearranged themselves in a way that made no useful sense, and the Chesterfield sofa against the far wall had been there, in his peripheral vision, the entire time. He sat down. The leather received him with the particular unhurried exhale of something made to last. He set the envelope on the cushion beside him. He pressed the back of his hand against his eye socket for a moment, then lowered it, then leaned his head back against the rolled arm of the sofa, and told himself he was simply resting his eyes and would return to the contract in a moment. 4 days of sleeplessness made a liar of him instantly and completely and without appeal. They found him like a monument. Bella reached the doorway of the main hall first, looked in, and went very still in the way she did when she was processing something that required careful thought. Then she turned back to her sisters and pointed with the solemn authority of an expedition leader who has located the intended destination. They approached him in single file, in the socked-footed silence that their mother had, through considerable effort, installed in them as a survival behavior. Though in this instance, the silence was generated not by fear, but by the breathless, concentrated reverence of 3 children approaching something extraordinary. The afternoon light fell across him through the tall windows, their shears diffusing it into something soft and pale. He was enormous against the sofa, dark-suited, dark-bearded. His chest rose and fell with the slow, defenseless rhythm of a man finally taken by the sleep he had been refusing for days. Mia held the tiara out toward Bella. Bella took it. This was understood between them without words, as most important things were. She reached up, stretching to the absolute outer limit of her arm's reach, and settled the tiara into the dark hair above his forehead with a steadiness of hand that was almost surgical. Chloe reached out and pressed 2 small fingers into the beard along his jaw, testing its texture with the focused, impersonal curiosity of a scientist encountering a new material. Mia simply stood and looked at him, her head tilted, her expression carrying the particular tenderness of someone who has decided, without condition or negotiation, that a thing deserves to be treated gently. The most feared man in the city slept on. The rhinestone tiara caught the light and threw small fractured stars across the ceiling above him. And in the servants' quarters, Brie finally turned around and found 3 empty spaces where her daughters had been. He surfaced slowly, the way a man does when the sleep has been deep enough to constitute a kind of small rescue. The first thing he was aware of was warmth, the afternoon light through the shears pressing against his closed eyelids in a way that was not unpleasant. The second thing was the leather of the Chesterfield beneath him, solid and familiar and real. The third thing was a sound he could not, in the first clouded seconds of waking, immediately classify. It was small and high and multiple, produced by more than one source, and it had a rhythmic, pressurized quality, as though something was working very hard to contain itself and failing incrementally. He opened his eyes. 3 identical faces were arranged above him at close range, watching him with the fixed, luminous attention of children who have been waiting for something to happen and have now been rewarded. Blonde, curly-haired, flushed with the effort of suppressed laughter, each of them gripping the edge of that restraint with diminishing success. Chloe's shoulders were already shaking. Mia had both hands pressed over her mouth, and Bella, who was closest, had abandoned all pretense entirely and was simply giggling in the open air with the full-bodied, unguarded abandon of someone who has never once in her life been required to make herself small. Raymond did not move. He looked at the first face, then the second, then the third. Then he became aware, by degrees, of something resting on his head. A mild, cool pressure he had not registered upon waking because it was so slight and so absurd that his nervous system had apparently declined to flag it as a priority. He reached up. His fingers found something small and rigid and multifaceted, and he lifted it from his hair and held it above his face and looked at it. A plastic tiara, pink, one prong missing, several of its rhinestones catching the afternoon light and distributing it in small, idiotic constellations across the coffered ceiling above him. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked back at the 3 faces. Something happened in Raymond Cucurella's chest that he had no current framework to identify. A sudden, structural shift, as though something that had been load-bearing for a very long time had simply, without warning, decided to put itself down. It moved upward through him with a speed and force he could not intercept, bypassing every mechanism of control he had spent 20 years constructing. And it came out of him as a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice at first, because he had not heard it in so long. He laughed. Not a polite sound, not the brief, performative acknowledgement of something mildly amusing that occasionally served social functions in his professional life. This was the other kind entirely. Unscheduled, unguarded, produced from somewhere below strategy and above reflex, the laugh of a man ambushed by something his defenses had never been designed to handle. It filled the main hall and rang off the Calacatta marble and reached the Murano chandelier overhead and came back down, changed, warmer, occupying the room in a way that all the expensive silence he had engineered had never quite managed. The triplets received this development with tremendous satisfaction. Bella clapped both hands together once, emphatically, the way a person does when a plan concludes exactly as intended. Mia dropped her hands from her mouth and laughed back at him, catching his frequency immediately. Chloe seized the tiara from his fingers and attempted to replace it on his head with an authority that brooked no resistance. He let her. He was still laughing when the doorway filled. Bree stood at the entrance to the main hall, breathing in the careful, deliberate way of a woman who had run through the east corridor and up the service stairs, and was now performing composure as an act of pure will. She took in the scene with rapid, comprehensive attention. Raymond on the Chesterfield, the tiara, the three girls crowded around him with the proprietary ease of children who have decided a thing belongs to them. Her face moved through several expressions too quickly to name before settling into something caught entirely between relief and a terror that had not yet finished metabolizing. Raymond looked at her. The laughter had subsided to something lower, still present in the lines of his face, changing the geography of it entirely. He held up the tiara. "You didn't say," he said, his voice carrying a quality she had never heard in it before, something dry and warm in equal measure, "that there were 3 of them." Bree opened her mouth, closed it. "The chocolate," he said, looking back at the girls with an expression that no one who knew him professionally would have believed belonged to his face. "That was all 3 of you." Bella, without a trace of guilt, nodded proudly. Raymond looked at the tiara in his hand one more time. Then he set it, with great deliberateness, back on top of his own head, and the main hall filled again with the sound of 3 small girls, absolutely beside themselves, and Bree pressed one hand over her mouth and didn't know whether she was about to laugh or dissolve entirely. It was Enzo who noticed first, not because he was watching the security feeds, though someone should have been, and the fact that no one was would become, in the hours that followed, a question with a very uncomfortable answer. But Enzo noticed because the Lutron lighting panel in the east corridor flickered once, at 4:17 p.m., a thing it had never done in the 3 years since the system had been installed, and Enzo was a man who had survived as long as he had precisely because he treated things that had never happened before with the full seriousness they deserved. He reached for his radio. The channel was dead. He tried his phone. No signal. Not diminished, not weak, but absent in the absolute, surgical way that only happens when someone who knows exactly what they are doing has made a deliberate decision about it. Enzo was already moving toward the main hall when the external lights along the north perimeter died in sequence, one after another, like a row of candles extinguished by a single breath, moving steadily toward the house. In the main hall, while none of this had yet arrived, Bree was sitting on the edge of the Chesterfield, and the girls had distributed themselves around Raymond with the calm confidence of children who have decided a situation is safe and are now administering it accordingly. Mia had claimed the armrest. Chloe was attempting to demonstrate the correct way to wear the tiara by placing it on Raymond's head, removing it, placing it on her own, and then returning it. A cycle she seemed prepared to continue indefinitely. Bella had located a Mont Blanc pen from the console table and was studying it with the focused, proprietary interest of someone who has found a very satisfying object and intends to keep it. Raymond had not moved them away from him. This was itself a fact so outside his established pattern of behavior that Bree kept waiting for the moment when his expression would close again, when the brief, extraordinary opening of the last 20 minutes would seal itself back over, and she would find herself looking at the familiar architecture of his face with all its gates shut. But the moment didn't come. He was watching the girls with a quality of attention she hadn't seen in him before, not the assessing, calibrating attention he directed at everything else, but something quieter and less defended than that. Something that looked, if she was being entirely precise about it, like a man seeing something he had stopped believing existed. She was about to say something. She didn't know what, only that the silence between them had shifted into a quality that seemed to require acknowledgement when the Murano chandelier overhead went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Out, completely, along with every other light source in the main hall simultaneously, plunging the room into the grey-blue of late afternoon filtered through shears, which was enough to see by but barely, and only because the sun had not yet finished with the day. One of the girls, Mia, made a small sound of surprise. Raymond was off the sofa before the sound completed itself. The transformation was instantaneous and total. The man who had been sitting with a plastic tiara balanced on his head was simply gone, replaced by something that moved through the dimmed room with a speed and economy that suggested the intervening 20 minutes had been a coat he had briefly tried on and had now removed. He crossed to the console table, reached beneath it, and produced a Beretta from the mounted bracket beneath the drawer that Bree had dusted around for 2 weeks without ever registering its presence. "Get them behind the sofa," he said, and his voice had returned to its winter register. "Now, stay down and do not move, regardless of what you hear." Bree gathered the girls with both arms and pulled them to the floor behind the Chesterfield without a word. 3 floors above the main hall, in the secondary monitoring room that connected to the service wing, the man sat in front of the Genetech display with its grid of now darkened feeds and spoke quietly into an encrypted handset. His name was Dario Reyes. He had been Raymond's lieutenant for 6 years and his subordinate before that, and he had understood, from the moment he reviewed the footage of Raymond Cucurella laughing on his own sofa with a child's tiara on his head, that the calculation had changed. A man who laughed like that, openly, without surveillance of his own expression, was a man no longer fully present in the world they both inhabited. Sentiment, in their profession, was not a private matter. It was a structural vulnerability. And structural vulnerabilities, left unaddressed, had a way of becoming everyone's problem. He had made phone calls. He had opened certain gates. He had given one instruction, clearly and without embellishment, to the men now moving through the north corridor in tactical silence. He set the handset down on the console and watched the dark feeds and waited with the patient stillness of a man entirely convinced of his own logic. He had not, in this calculation, fully accounted for what Raymond Cucurella looked like when he had something worth protecting. That omission would prove costly. The panic room was behind the Basquiat, not beside it, not near it. Behind it, the entire canvas mounted on a hydraulic arm that swung inward on a biometric command, revealing a reinforced door with a Cabermas lock, and walls behind it, lined in ballistic composite that could absorb things Bree did not want to think about with 3 children pressed against her sides. Raymond had it open in 4 seconds. He put his hand on Bree's shoulder, moved her through the door with a firm, non-negotiable pressure, and the girls followed because their mother was moving, and they had learned, in the last 10 days, that when their mother moved with that particular quality of urgency, questions came later. "The lock engages from inside," Raymond said. He was looking at Bree with the focused, efficient attention of a man transmitting information he needs received correctly. "There is a secondary phone on the left wall. No network required. Direct line to a frequency Enzo monitors. If I am not back in 20 minutes, use it." "Raymond, 19 minutes and 50 seconds now," he said, and swung the Basquiat closed between them. The main hall was dark and quiet, and full of men who believed they had the advantage. As they moved in the practiced formation of professionals, staggered, low, communicating in the compressed signals of people who had done this before in other houses belonging to other men who had made other enemies. They were good. Raymond, moving barefoot now along the upper gallery that overlooked the hall, assessed this with the same dispassion he assessed everything, which was to say completely and without sentiment. They were good and they were disciplined, and they believed the house was empty of anything that mattered. They had not been briefed on the toys. The solar system puzzle had migrated from the servants' quarters sometime in the previous 48 hours. Raymond had not known this, and Bree had not known this. Morton, the man currently moving along the Calcutta marble in tactical boots, discovered it in the most direct way available, his lead foot coming down on the hard plastic edge of Saturn and skating forward with a violence that removed him from the equation, with considerable speed and a sound that was, in different circumstances, the kind of sound that makes people laugh. Raymond was already moving. He came off the gallery stairs with the Beretta, and the total, unencumbered commitment of a man who has resolved the question of what he is protecting and requires nothing further from the situation except its conclusion. The darkness that had been designed to disadvantage him was, in practice, immaterial. He had walked every corridor of this house in silence for 6 years, had mapped it at 3 in the morning and 4 and 5, had learned its dimensions not as a floor plan, but as a physical fact encoded in his body. He knew where the promemoria console table sat, and at what height its corner arrived. He knew the exact location of the Lalique vase on the hall credenza, and the 3 marble steps up to the east corridor, and the place where the herringbone floor transitioned to runner and altered the acoustic entirely. The men moving through his house knew none of these things. Bella's plush animals had been arranged along the east corridor windowsill 2 days ago, in a configuration that remained undisturbed. The first man through the corridor door encountered them at chest height, reached reflexively for his weapon, and in the half-second of recalibration that followed, Raymond made a decision that ended the encounter. Out the Mont Blanc pen, Bella's acquisition from the console table, set down on the second stair when something shinier had apparently presented itself, caught the boot of the next man at precisely the right angle on a marble surface that offered no forgiveness. Raymond moved through the house the way the house had always moved around him, in silence, with purpose, without excess. Each room presented its problem, and he resolved it with the flat, methodical efficiency of a man working through a list. The Chesterfield in the main hall bought him a second of blocked sightline. The Murano chandelier, when he restored power to that circuit alone from the breaker in the service cupboard, flooded the room in light that the men below had not prepared their eyes for. He was thorough. He was fast. And underneath the efficiency, underneath the controlled and practiced mechanics of it, something burned that had not been present in any previous version of this. Not cold, not professional, not the detached competence of a man defending territory. This was a father moving through a house toward a door, and every obstacle between him and that door was simply a thing to be removed. He reached the monitoring room on the 3rd floor 7 minutes after he had closed the Basquiat. Dario Reyes was still sitting at the Genetec console when Raymond opened the door. The feeds were still dark. Dario turned in the chair slowly, with the careful movements of a man recalculating in real time, and looked at Raymond standing in the doorway, unhurried, unmarked, holding the Beretta with the loose, practiced ease of something that had become in the last 12 minutes simply an extension of his hand. Raymond looked at his lieutenant for a long moment, at the man who had stood beside him for 6 years, in rooms that required exactly this quality of nerve, and had now, finally, revealed the precise location of his loyalty. "You watch the cameras," Raymond said quietly. Dario said nothing. "You watched the cameras," Raymond said again, "and you saw a man laughing. He let this sit in the room for a moment. And you decided that was the dangerous version of me." He stepped inside and closed the door. 12 minutes later, he walked back down the stairs, rolled his shirt sleeves down, and opened the Basquiat. Bree heard the biometric lock disengage and had the secondary phone in her hand before the canvas had finished swinging open. Raymond stood in the gap where the Basquiat had been. His jacket was gone. His white shirt was rolled to the elbows, and he had clearly made an effort at composure, the kind of effort that is visible precisely because it has been made. But he was present and upright, and his eyes, when they found hers, carried the specific quality of a man who has concluded a thing and is no longer in doubt about any part of it. Bree set the phone down. She looked at him for one long moment with the assessment of a woman taking inventory of something she had been afraid she might lose. Then Mia pushed past her and wrapped both arms around Raymond's left leg, and the assessment dissolved into something that required no words from either of them. The police arrived at 5:43. Raymond had called them himself, which was either the most audacious element of the entire evening or the most logical, depending on how well you understood the way his particular world operated. He met them at the door in a fresh Keaton shirt, his expression composed, and his account of events both consistent and delivered with the unhurried confidence of a man who has nothing to hide, and even less to explain. A credible threat had been neutralized on his private property. His security team had responded accordingly. The appropriate documentation would be made available at the appropriate time. He directed them to Enzo, who had appeared from the east corridor, with the precise moment's timing of a man who had been waiting for his cue and who handled the operational conversation with the smooth, unruffled competence that had made him indispensable for 11 years. Or the detective in charge, a broad-shouldered woman with patient eyes that Raymond recognized as the eyes of someone who understood more than she was currently choosing to address, looked at him for a long moment at the end of the interview. "You have a good evening, Mr. Cucurella," she said, in a tone that placed equal weight on every word. "I intend to," he said, and closed the door. He found Bree in the kitchen. She had made tea, not because anyone had asked for it, but because she was a person who, when confronted with situations beyond the boundaries of her control, defaulted to doing something useful with her hands. The Christopher kettle was on the Gaggenau, and 3 Bernardaud cups were arranged on the counter, and the girls were seated at the kitchen island in a row. They are unnaturally still in the way that children are, when they have grasped that the adults around them are managing something large and have decided, for once, to allow it. Raymond came in and stood at the island and looked at the 3 of them, and Bella looked back at him, with her chin resting on her folded hands and her expression carrying the particular gravity of a child who has had an eventful afternoon and feels this should be acknowledged. Raymond looked at Bree. "You're fired," he said. The kettle was very loud in the silence that followed. Bree set it down carefully on the Patagonia counter and turned to face him with her hands at her sides, and her expression composed into the same careful stillness she had been assembling and reassembling in this house for nearly 2 weeks. The expression of a woman who has decided, to whatever happens, that she will receive it standing up. "You're rehired," Raymond said, as the lady of the house. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without decoration, as though the words were simply facts being transferred from one person to another. "I need someone to manage these 3 queens, and I find that the position has become non-negotiable." Bree looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her face that she made no effort to govern, and she turned back to the counter and pressed the back of her wrist briefly against her cheek, and he had the courtesy to look at the girls instead. The peace treaty took 4 phone calls and most of the following morning. Raymond sat in his Poltrona Frau chair with the phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying its usual low, a final-sounding authority through conversations that would reshape the terms of engagement across 3 territories and remove certain questions from the table for the foreseeable future. He was, by any measure, conducting the most consequential negotiation of the last 2 years. Mia was painting his left thumbnail, a color called, according to the bottle in Chloe's authoritative possession, Duchess Rose. Bella had claimed the right hand and was applying a second coat to his index finger with the focused, unhurried professionalism of someone who has decided this is her area of expertise. She did not look up when he shifted in the chair. She simply waited, brush suspended, and resumed when he was still again. Raymond glanced down once between calls. The Audemars Piguet on his wrist caught the morning light. His nails caught it differently now, pink, meticulous, applied with tremendous care by small hands that had decided he was worth the effort. He picked up the phone for the fourth call. He looked out over the topiary garden where the fountain ran in pale amber light, and for the first time in longer than he could reliably calculate, the silence of the house was not something he had built and was defending. It was something that had simply settled around him, warm and undemanding, while 3 small girls painted his hands the color of roses. He did not mind it at all.